Well, this morning we're finishing our last sermon in the series, God Is, and it's been a kind of a short series on the doctrine of God. And so this is kind of a really big topic. I mean, theology is the study of God. And so for us to take 6 weeks and say the study of God, I mean, it's a pretty much an overview. So if you missed some of those sermons, I want to catch up with some of the things that you've missed. We talked about things about God being near. Last Sunday, we talked about God as the Trinity. What do we mean? What do we believe in the sense of God being Trinitarian? We talked about God is alive. God's not dead. He's surely alive, right? You hear that song, Caleb? God's not a created thing, right? He just is. And so to help illustrate that, each of you got a thing of Play-Doh. If you didn't get one, we have more out there. And so this is not, because we're like realizing, okay, people are bored in church, so we're going to give them some Play-Doh. This is so you go home and you remember, like, what we're talking about here. So what I did is I think people view God like you do a big ball of Play-Doh. And what you do with Play-Doh, right, you think of like, I can just make anything with this ball of Play-Doh. I can make a snowman. I can make a face, I can make whatever. And then they have like all these things out. If you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. It's all these little like, I don't know what you call them. They're little like cookie cutter things, whatever, and you can make shapes out of them. People do that with Play-Doh, right? Because you can make shapes of whatever you want to do. And people kind of see God that same way. Like, God, I view you as a loving God, so this is how I think you should look. And you start rolling and you start making, and then this image of your head of what you think God looks like, and this is the picture you've got in your mind of who God is. And someone says, no, God can't be that way. God's got to be this way. And so then you start making and molding and making God. And before you realize it, your Play-Doh looks different than my Play-Doh and their Play-Doh and their Play-Doh, and we all have these different conceptions of who God is in our minds. That's not God. That is a product of your imagination. God is. He just is. In the Old Testament, when God's sharing who he is to Moses in the burning bush, he says, who are you? God says, I am. Like, that's his name, is I am. Just philosophically, God just is. He's uncreated. We all have beginnings. God did not. And so as you remember just the series, we hope that just anything we do in preaching, that'd be transformative. It wouldn't just be something you'd hear and say, good sermon, and then leave the next day. It'd be something you take throughout your life. And so I hope that every time you see a thing of Play-Doh, you'll remember that we're not here to mold God into our own image, but God just is, and we should change ourselves to be conformed to his image. So just remember that, and this is something for you just to take and remember just what that means. This morning we're talking about the fact that God is transcendent. And I'll explain what that means in a second. Last week, Nick talked about God being imminent, God being near, God being close. And what that means is kind of two different ways that people typically see God, and the Bible mentions both of these. God is both imminent and he's transcendent. Imminence is this idea where God is with us all the time. And we know that biblically, right? Because if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit is with you. Holy Spirit is convicting you of sin. I see that God intervenes himself throughout time. God's not just sitting back up in the heavens looking down and saying, I hope they figure this out. But God is directly intervening and directly helping. You read through the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all the way to Revelation. God is moving throughout people, humanity. He's not sitting back unconcerned with what's going on with the plight of mankind. And the biggest example we have of that is who? Jesus. God taking on human flesh, coming in the form of a servant, dying on the cross, paying the price for our sin. And he does this to restore the relationship which we have messed up because of our sin. God has made himself near. But God is not just near, but he's also transcendent. He's beyond. God created the entire universe from nothing. The phrase ex nihilo is what the theologians use, out of nothing, where God spoke and things appeared. God made things from his voice. And God is sitting back. God's in control. We see it read in Colossians, I think a passage Nick read last week about God being in everything and his decrees making things to be. God doesn't let things happen that he's surprised by. He's like, oh man, I missed that one. I missed that one over here. And so God is in control of it all. Sometimes it's hard for us to reconcile because we go, man, if you've seen the craziness going on in this world, how could God be in control? God's got a plan. God's got a purpose. There is purpose in the chaos, and God's bringing all of it to restoration, redemption, and ultimately his own glory. That God is glorious. God is the one, it's his show. He's done it all, and it's all for him. And his transcendence of that God being distinctly away from us in the sense that he's above us. He is different than us. God is not like we are. God has always been perfect. God has always been living, alive. God has always been who he is. Right? We were created. We are not perfect. We do not have all knowledge. We do not have all power. We do not have presence. God does. He is. And so when we understand that God is very different than us, and even in kind of some of our conversations we've had the last few weeks, and talking about who God is and the nature of who God is, one of the things that I just want to make sure we're really clear on in this is that because God's not Play-Doh, it's going to be hard for us to completely reconcile all the bigness of who God is. Remember as a kid, and you looked up, and I was taking my son, we had to go do some errands in downtown Salt Lake City, and I'm watching my son, he's 2, he's looking up at the big skyscrapers in downtown Salt Lake City, and he's just like staring up at them like this. And you just kind of forget like buildings and their heights and things like that. And I'm like, I bet for the first time, he's realizing like how tall these buildings are. Like that's probably going across his mind right now. I mean, if I wish I could get in his head and just see what he's thinking, because I bet it's kind of a cool feeling. Because I remember the first time I walked in New York City, and you just see city for miles. You're like, whoa, this is so huge. And everywhere you look, it's just massive and massive. And that's man-made things. But now, God who created the universe, can you imagine just looking up at him and just trying to understand as we look up, man, there's just this mystery. Like, whoa, he's just so big. He's just so massive. We should never lose that mystery. And when you don't have that mystery there, you're not worshiping God. You're worshiping some kind of fictitious thing you've created. And that mystery is good. Now again, I want to make sure we throw a warning up to say, this doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say, I can't understand God, so I should not try to find out more about him. Right? That's not what we're saying. God is mysterious, and that thought should definitely wreck our minds. But on the flip side of that, we should remember that God has revealed himself to us in his word. And he wants us to study more about him and to understand more about him. So we should say, I don't understand this, but I'm willing to study and to follow and to seek and to find, and I'm going to go after this thing. So in all this, just kind of a warning at the end of this, God is mysterious. We're not going to completely figure him out, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we're not continually learning more and more about him. Both have to be held in tension. And to have a healthy balance there, you have to hold both in tension. Now, in tension and talking about today and what we talked about last week, God's nearness and God's farness, or God's immanence and God's transcendence, both of those also have to be held in tension. And what I mean by that is that we can very easily, and I think a lot of our bad theology comes from one side or the other. And a lot of times in Scripture, in theology, if you tend to emphasize one thing over another, especially things that are in balance or in tension, you can have some messed up theology. Bad things happen to the way that you see about God. For example, if I talked about God's transcendence and you said, yes, God is far above us, you may be like a lot of the early American fathers of America who are deists. And a lot of them said, okay, God made the world like he made a watch. And he wound it up and he stepped back and let it go. And those guys don't believe God's immanence, his closeness. But then on the flip side of that, you've got others who are so wrapped up in God's immanence. And Nick talked about this last week where it's like everything is like, God, there's a sign in this and a sign in this and a sign in this and a sign in that. And before you realize it, everything is centered around you. It has nothing to do with God's bigness, his transcendence, and we forget of who God is. I remember one time I was teaching a Sunday school class. And as I was teaching the class, one of the ladies in the class said, I'm just having trouble with this idea of like God being like close in this personal relationship thing that we're talking about. And I understood where she was coming from. She came from a background that there was, the bigness of God was definitely there. but she was struggling with this idea of this personal relationship with God. And I said, imagine if like your dad was the king of some kind of country, but this is still your dad. Now, your dad has the ability and power to destroy anybody he wants to because he is the one who has the rule and he has the law. But at the same time, he's your dad. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, this is our Father, right? He's our Father, but at the same time, he owns everything. He owns it all. So there's a degree of fear, and I mean by fear, not being afraid, but respect for who God is, but at the same time, a degree of personality there and personal relationship there, where we have both kind of enjoined together. And that's what this thing is. And so today we're going to be talking more about the bigness of God, as Nick talked about the imminence, the closeness, the nearness of God last Sunday. And we're going to be talking in Psalm 93, and again, there's a lot of passages that talk about the bigness of God. I mean, all the Bible talks about how great God is and how big he is and how massive and amazing he is. But what I love about the Psalms is there's this kind of like beautiful, like just awe and wonder that David has, or whoever the psalmist is, it's writing about God. And he's just captivated by the might and amazingness of God. Like I just feel like this is something we should have as well. That type of mystery should captivate us about God. And we should never lose that. And so when you read through the Psalms, it's like just this really cool feeling of just like, he just gushes on about God. Like that's kind of the way we should be too. That's how we should never get so wrapped up in ourselves we forget who he is. So let's look in Psalm 93, and let's read starting in verse 1. It says, "The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring, mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Your decrees are very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore." In a lot of the Psalms, and again, they have different purposes, different meanings. This one here is really just going on and on about the glory of God, the magnificence, again, from a bigness perspective. And the first one we see here in verse 1, this idea of the Lord reigning, that God is king. He's king. And this kind of goes into a little bit of the sovereignty of God, the rule of God, that God is in control. He owns it. He owns it all. A lot of times with my kids, when you get a toy, and what happens is one kid wants the other toy, and usually they only want the other toy if the one kid picks it up first. But like they're not interested at all until one of my kids picks it up and the other one's all of a sudden interested in it. And you're like, how come that is? So I was like, why is it just then? And it's about this whole thing, and they only like, well, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine. You hear all this, and this is my toy, my toy. So sometimes I like to go in there and be like, hold on, guys. It's actually not your toys. Those are my toys, and I let you play with them because I bought them. And these are our things. This is our house, and we're letting you live here as a part of our family. Because I want my kids to understand this whole thing with possessions. And hopefully, in that process, teaching them that even this house, I'm saying this is mine to my kids, but it's not even really mine. It's all God's. Every bit of it is his. He owns it all. He owns it. And you think a king of a land, and again, we live in a representative democracy. It's not a monarchy, but in a monarchy, a strong monarchy, you've got over us at all. Like we're in a kind of a wave of entrepreneurship right now, and there's like Silicon Valley and all this stuff going on, and just all these startups, and now like all these things are disrupting industries. Like I read this really fascinating biography on Elon Musk, and there's this guy who made like the SpaceX and Tesla and all these industries that are going to disrupt possibly the car industry, the space industry, all these things. You've got Uber now, which is like putting taxi cabs out of business. I mean, all these different businesses, because startups, and a lot of this comes from these guys who just say, I don't really want to live with a boss. I want to be the boss. But even in that, there's always somebody above us, right? You always have somebody telling you what to do, what you can't do. Here's the laws. Here's the laws of the land. Here's what you have to do. You have to obey. You have to follow, and if you don't, you'll be in trouble. We have people over us all the time. Our control, our own personal sovereignty, that we think that we have control over our lives, is just an illusion. When you think that you are the one who makes all the decisions for yourself and that you're invincible, it's an illusion. Found out last week my dad had melanoma. And they just cut it out, and hopefully there's nothing wrong with that. But even in that, it's a scary thing. Cancer is one of those deals where you go, man, that's a hard one. Like that's one where obviously it takes people out. It's one of those ones that make you think, like, man, life is short. We don't have as much control as we think that we do. And even in my own life, right? I could die in an instant. I could find out I have a heart attack. I mean, I've heard crazy stories of people dying from heart attacks at the age of 30. This is not to scare you, to be like, oh, I'm going to die today. But to say that we don't have control over our own lives. We think that we have control over our lives, but we do not. It is an illusion. God is in control over it all. He is sovereign. He rules. He reigns. He created the universe from nothing. I'm playing with Play-Doh, right? He created from nothing. God rules. He reigns. God is majestic. It says here also in verse 1, he is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. And this picture, this imagery, you've got this picture of a king, and he's sitting on his throne, and his robe is massive, and he's got all this stuff. And you've seen pictures or movies of just like the king, and everything. It's like is so huge in the room. And it's designed to make you realize who you're in the room with. You're not in the room with just some random guy. You're in the room with the king of that land. And it's supposed to inspire this sort of awe in you where you go, man, I don't want to mess with this guy, but at the same time, he also rules and reigns here. It's majestic. It's majestic. And God has made his majesty over everything that we have. I mean, if you've ever just been up to the Grand Canyon or Bryce Canyon, or just some of those cool things, just seeing something just so beautiful, I believe that is draped in God's majesty over his creative things, over his earth. Like, you see the majesty of God. You see the majesty of God if you're a biologist looking at a molecule of DNA. I mean, I think the majesty of God is written all over that, right? How cool is that? How amazing is that? Everything in which we see, everything that God has made himself evidently and abundantly clear overall. He's majestic. He deserves the most mighty and most amazing throne and train and all that he is. 3, we see that God is creator. Again, in verse 1, it says, yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. It shall never be moved. Now, what that means in there is not that the world is not going to have problems or even possibly even be destroyed at some point, but it means that this creative thing, universe that God has created it, God has made it to be, and God can cease for it to be, but no human being can make that happen. And again, of course, we can do terrible things to our planet and destroy our planet, but I'm talking about the universe. It's creative, God has made, right? That God has made this to be, and he's the one who has brought it into being. One of the laws of thermodynamics, matter cannot be created or destroyed. Even like in crazy things like nuclear bombs or whatever else that goes off, and matter makes great changes. Matter can't be created or destroyed. It's kind of one of those things you keep. And if you're a chemistry major or something, it's one of the things you kind of help you go through, that you can't make matter, you can't destroy matter. It just is. And so we know that's part of the conservations there. You can kind of trust that one. God made matter. God can take away matter. God made energy. God can take away energy. God is creator over it all. You and I are not that creators. We're not those kind of creators. Again, we can play with Play-Doh. We can make things with our hands. And I believe that reflects the creator God, because aren't we images of God, image bearers of God, that God has said he made us in his own image, and the creation has been very good, man and woman created. And I think that's a part of that. I mean, that's what C.S. Lewis said all the time when it came to all kinds of things like art or literature or whatever it may be, or woodworking. I mean, whatever it can be, and things that we can make with our hands. It shows the creative aspect of who God is. I mean, just go to the zoo and just see the myriad of animals and the myriad of things that are around, and just how beautiful and how amazing all those things are. I mean, it's just so cool. How many different types of snakes and how many different types of lizards and monkeys and all birds and all this other stuff like that. It's cool. God created it. God made it. I think in that, knowing that he's the one that's created it and we're not, we remember to have this kind of, again, this awe towards God, this respect towards God. For God has always been, let's get down to verse 2. It says, your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. Right? That God has always been. We have been created. I saw my kids, each one of them when they were born. It's just a cool opportunity. It's a great moment to be a father and just to see your kids being born. And my dad had the same thing for me, and on and on and on back. To see, we know when our beginning was. God never had a beginning, right? The throne is established from old. You are from everlasting. That word everlasting. Never ending. Never ending. And that's so hard for us to even fathom, right? That God, how is it possible that God didn't have a beginning like everything else had a beginning in this world, this universe, but God didn't? That just seems crazy. But at the same time, if you're wrestling with that, like how can God never have a beginning? Just think about who God is. He's the one who made it all. It all came from him. Everything which we've seen in this universe has had a cause for its existence. We saw our own births. We could take back this building many years ago, even through all the changes and transformations. It used to be a movie theater at one point. I think they have cheap movies here. I think at one point they had like concerts here and like music venue, all the different things. But at some point it had a beginning. And it was created, and it was made, and it was built, and they had construction crews out, and they built it, and they made it, and they poured the foundations, and they did all of that. God did not have a beginning. He just was. He is. God just is. He's always been. And if you're wrestling with that again, maybe just think about it like this. I'm going to talk more from a philosophical standpoint for a second. What's more incredulous to believe, or just hard to believe? That everything in which we see in this whole world, this whole universe, came from nothing, and nothing somehow made it all. Or we believe in an eternal God who always was, always is, and he made the universe to be. Which one's harder to believe? Nothing made everything, or God made everything? God who always was, who never had a beginning. For me, I'm wrestling more with the nothing one. That doesn't make sense to me. God always being here, God being the one who created all, yeah, that makes sense. 5, God is all powerful. In verse 3, it says, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring, mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. In ancient times and even in today's times, waters were an amazing thing because you needed the water from the river to feed your crops, right? To water your land. And so they would use the water and funnel in the water to do that. But there was also bad times with water. If you didn't have enough water, you couldn't grow your crops. We went to Southeast Asia last year, and we're going back this year. And there, in farming, it's a farming community. It's a farming culture. They need the rain. They need the water for their crops. And if they don't eat. They struggle. They have no money to bring in for their families. And so water is a huge thing. You need water to take care of what's going on. But water, too much of it, is also a bad thing. I'm from South Carolina. I lived in New Orleans for 3 years. We moved there right after Hurricane Katrina. If you saw what happened with Hurricane Katrina with floodwaters, you know the devastation that floods can have on a place. If you've ever been there and seen it, it's bad. Right now, there's still flooding going on in Louisiana. In the northern part of northwest of New Orleans a little bit, Baton Rouge area, and that part of Louisiana, they've had lots of flooding. It's been bad. The church that I used to serve with in New Orleans, they just took a mission trip out to another church there and try to help, pull some stuff out of houses and just to go into a house that's been flooded and been destroyed and where the sheetrock is just kind of falling apart. And there's mold everywhere. You open a fridge, and it's one of the worst smells of your life because this food has been sitting there for who knows how long, never been opened, and it's one of the worst stenches you'll ever smell. Like, this is all there. And floods can have a terrible effect on a family. Women losing their wedding dresses, photos, memories, things that you can't put a price tag on. And that destroys it all. Floods can have a devastating effect. If you've seen the tsunami that hit Japan several years ago, I remember watching like this YouTube video of it, and they showed the water coming in, and it looks so slow. It looks kind of like it's coming in, but it is just moving houses off of their foundations and lifting up cars and all these things, and it's just moving them very easily. When we think about floods and the power of floods and the might that it does, especially if you're thinking in these days, it has just this power that is kind of unrivaled. And when you think about the power of God, God is all powerful. If you think floods have power, you don't know anything about who God is and the power that God's got. God is incredibly powerful. And again, if God can create the universe from nothing, God has the power to create life from death. He has the power over all these things and all the amazing things that we see around, and more powerful than the most powerful things you could think of. God is more powerful. God is stronger. That should remind us to have trust in him. I think one of the big things we can take from that is that because God is all powerful and I am not, I know that I can trust him in his power. That if God wanted to, he could do the most amazing things for us, and we can trust him in that. Now, God doesn't always display that type of power all the time. And again, I think for many reasons, but one of the reasons why is because he wants us to trust him. He wants us to follow him, to believe in him, to see what he's going to do. And so if we were to understand who God is, right, in that sense. I know stories of people. This lady at my church growing up, she had a tumor in her stomach. And this is a true story. Doctor looking at it, they're going in for some other scan or something else to check it out, and it's like gone one day. It's like they can't see it. And I don't know if it was a blip on the screen. I don't know what was going on there. But is it possible God removed that tumor? Yes, it is entirely possible. God took that tumor and just made it disappear. God has a power over those kinds of things. Now, does God always let those things happen? No, I know people in the same hand who've died from cancer, praying that God would take care of them, and God chose not to. That same God that is all powerful is also God that is trustworthy. Ending in verse 5. He says, your decrees are very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. The thing that was hard for us to reconcile, I think, if we're just really honest about who God is this whole thing of trusting who God is. Trusting him. Okay, we have to first get our heads wrapped around this idea of who is he. And secondly, we have to trust in his nature and his character. Trusting him. Trusting him is a hard thing for us as human beings. Because again, if we like to be in control, if we're the ones who like to make things happen, trust may be a hard thing for you. Maybe trust is a hard thing for you because you've had people let you down. And you've watched those people mess with you. You've watched with those people get your hopes up, and then the next moment, they drop them. And you're like, man, I just can't trust anybody. I don't know if I can trust God. His decrees are trustworthy. He's trustworthy. No, what does that mean? It's knowing that he intends to make the best decisions, best decrees that are going to bring himself the most glory. And in that, in him glorifying himself, we know that he is a God of grace. He's a God of mercy. He's a God of love. He's a God of wrath. He's a God of fear. He's all these different things. God of holiness. And in that, right, what glorifies himself is him saving people for himself. Right? The fact that he says, there are people going out into danger and I'm going to rescue them and I'm going to save them. We should trust in that. We should trust in his character and his nature. We don't have to fear that or to think, man, maybe God's got some other motives here. No, God is good. He defines good. You ever think about it like the terms of, how do you know what you believe is good and what you think is wrong without God? How is anything good and how is anything bad without God? You say, well, whatever feels right that it's good. What made you even think that there is such a thing as good? You think if God didn't exist, would good and evil really exist? Would we really know what good was and what bad was? No, because God has placed it on our hearts. It said there is such a thing as good, and we're after that, and we want good. God has put that desire there. Now, it gets messed up from our own lives and what we think is good, and it gets corrupted, our own desires for good and evil. But God has placed that on your heart. And we should trust him in that and knowing who God is and what he's going to do. That doesn't mean we're always going to have the answers. Doesn't mean we're always figure it out. I think, again, going back to my kids, because I think it's such a great analogy with a kid to his parents. And how many times to my kids, I'm like, I'm going to hold your hand when I'm crossing the street. Why do I want to hold their hand when I'm crossing the street? So I don't want them to get hit by a car. Now, my kids don't want me to hold their hand all the time, especially my son. He's like, Mister, I'm going to do this myself. He doesn't want me to hold his hand. But I'm doing that for his protection, his safety. We don't see the full picture of what goes on. It'd be nice if we did, right? It would be great if we say, okay, God, can you just show me all of time, show me everything that's going to happen, everything that's happened, and show me how this all fits in, just planned out. That'd be great, right? Because if we could see that, like, oh yeah, I trust you now, God, but that's not trust. That's still us being in control. Trust says, God, I believe you've got this in your hands. You've got this figured out. I may not understand exactly how it all plays out, but God, I'm trusting in who you are, in your nature, in your character, in that you are going to bring things about for your purposes. Don't fully understand it, and that's okay. If you admit that, you're being honest. I'm with you on there. But trusting God says, God, I'm putting my eggs in this basket. I'm putting my eggs in this basket. Now, here's the kind of the crazy thing. If that's hard for you, I don't know if I can put my eggs in that basket, trusting God. What are you trusting in? Because you're going to be trusting in something. You're going to be believing in something. You're going to believe either believing in yourself, the wisdom of mankind, some other people in your life, but you're going to be putting your eggs in some basket. Every day you get in a car and you drive down the road to your place of work and you go home at night. I don't know about you, but my life doesn't flash before my eyes every time I get into a car. But what about that guy that gets on a road and a drunk driver comes in and he kills him that day? I guarantee you that guy wasn't thinking he was going to die. He's trusting that he's going to get from point A to point B. He's trusting in himself that he's going to make this happen in his life, or this happen, or this happen, or this happen. You're trusting in something. Everybody trusts in something. God, who created heavens and earth, who created life from death, darkness, everything that he is, all the goodness that he is, why not trust him instead of these man-made things that we create? What can these things do for you and for me? They can't do anything. They don't have that kind of power. They don't have that kind of ability. God is in control. He's sovereign. He's over it all. And because of who he is, because of what he's done, because of all that is in him, we can trust him. And we can trust in what he's going to do. We don't have all the answers. Doesn't mean we're always going to have it all figured out, but we can trust God. That's the one thing you can hang your hat on in this world, is that we can trust God. Now, we're going to make sure we get who he is right. Right? Now, that's important. But we can trust God. As we kind of close today, the question I got for you is, do you trust in a God who is sovereign, a God who is king, a God who is creator, or are you trusting in a created thing? Is that where your trust is? Whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, maybe this is something as you've been sitting here today, God's just placed on your heart. And I don't know if I am. As I realize my sin. I need Jesus. I want to place my trust in God. And God has been showing you this even just throughout the sermon. I would love to talk with you about that. If you're just needing someone just to pray with you, me and Nick will be in the back and a few others. We'd love to pray over you, pray with you, pray what God's doing in you, and maybe some things that you've been convicted of even as we talk today. Let's pray.